Passed like 7 months ago, so we'll sort it out. Must be, yeah. Those who missed it, your time, 10-minute timer is the iPad that's on the podium. So you time yourself. Sounds good. On the system. Okay. May you pay attention.
Angela, nice to meet you.
Oh, and I forget, you go after me, right? Make sure you can adjust the microphone.
Sure. What? You don't think I'm that tall?
Oh, go for it.
Just double checking if it was pronounced more in
Yes. Naaman. You would say do it. Yeah.
got it. Okay.
All right. Welcome back, everyone. Is the mic on? So glad you could make it on a Saturday despite the nasty New York weather. I'm sure more people are going to be trickling in. We had a wonderful first day yesterday. Someone said this event is the Coachella of tech policy. We're going to officially change the name next year to that. But I think the second day is going to be awesome. We have 2 panels today, and after that, many of the speakers are going to be sticking around for lunch, and I hope all of you will. And it's a chance to mingle and have further discussions about these topics. So the moderator for the first panel today is Mor Naaman. He's a professor of information science at Cornell Tech, and his lab focuses on the trustworthiness of the information ecosystem. So he has really deep expertise in the areas of this event, and we're really glad that he was able to make time to be a moderator for the panel today. And he's won many awards. I won't go through his full bio. You can see it on the conference website. Take it away, Mor.
All right, good morning. Thank you all for coming this morning. Clearly we have here the attendees that are not only the hardiest, but also the most diligent. Of course, also the smartest and the most attractive. And for those online, I can only assume the most European. In any case, you guys are the best. Thank you for coming. I'm going to keep it short. We have, I think I've seen a lot of great talks and discussion. We have, I think, surprisingly little in terms of understanding the experience of actual people in this algorithmic amplification environment. This panel is not going to entirely close the gap, but at least we're going to have some hints at it. But instead, I think this panel can provide most significantly ammunition and ideas for the reform panel that we have next, including some data, what needs fixing, as well as some ideas of what might work and might not work. So with that, to give us these ideas, we have a great set of speakers that are, I'm going to call them the next generation of academic thinking on this topic. First up, I have the bio here. We have Jason Burton, who is an assistant professor at the Copenhagen Business School and an Alexander van Humboldt research fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development. His research uses computational methods to study human behavior in the context of the digital society. Jason, all yours.
Okay. Not quite as tall. So good morning, everybody. As Mor and Arvind said, this is clearly the hardcore crew, 9:30 in the rain. Thanks for being here. My name is Jason Burton. I'm a psychologist who studies how new technologies impact people's ability to reason with information, make good decisions, and generally form accurate beliefs about the world. And while I think many of us often find ourselves feeling pessimistic or cynical about the role of algorithms in social media and society, today I'd like to argue for a slightly more positive view. My vision of social media and the internet at large is one in which the algorithmic curation of content online is not viewed as a danger to be mitigated, but as an opportunity. In my vision, the internet provides an online public sphere where people go to deliberate, to be informed, and to develop some kind of collective intelligence. And right now, that sounds kind of utopian, but it wasn't so long ago that social media was labeled a liberation technology that was going to usher in the era of the more informed, more engaged citizen. And in some ways, that is in fact what it's doing. So here we see the results of a recent meta-analysis that covers roughly 500 academic studies on the effects of digital media use on democracy. And what's clear is that studies overwhelmingly find that digital media use associates with increased civic participation. Intuitively, these technologies allow people to get involved in political discussions and to engage with each other, which is a good thing for democracy. But the effects on people's actual knowledge are much more mixed, and at the same time, digital media use is also generally associated with increased exposure to misinformation and increasing polarization, which often has been catching the news headlines. So why is this the case? Why has social media and the internet provided an online public sphere that seems so ill-suited to truly informed deliberation and collective intelligence? There's obviously no one single answer to this, but a main hypothesis centers on the theme of this symposium, algorithmic amplification. And in particular, the observation that algorithms curating content online are promoting content to users for the hope of maximizing engagement, right? And the worry is that the content that is most engaging is not necessarily the content that is informative. So what can we do about it? How can we move towards an online public sphere that caters to and elicits collective intelligence? There are many proposed ways to improve things. I, of course, skew towards the psychology literature, but proposals there include fact-checking and labeling misleading content, nudging people to be more self-reflective before spreading information, boosting people's digital competencies, and introducing regulation to help people take control of their personal data. All of those things seem meaningful and worthwhile, but all operate on the front end, so to speak, and mostly, I'd argue, put the burden on the user while leaving the fundamental structure of online environments unchanged. Another way to approach it, though, might be to redesign the back end. So in other words, to redesign the algorithms that underlie the online platforms we go to for information. The important point here is that I'm not arguing or suggesting that we get rid of content curating algorithms. Without them, we'd be faced with a paralyzing overload of information that would be impossible to navigate. Instead, what I'm suggesting is that we design those algorithms to optimize for something other than engagement. And this is what I'm looking at in some ongoing research. But in particular, what I'm interested in is collective accuracy in judgment, decision-making, or forecasting. So what I want to develop are algorithms that will promote content to users such that after some time on the platform, the aggregated judgment of the users becomes more accurate with respect to some objective ground truth. So for example, you can imagine people debating online over whether a surge in cases of some novel disease will overwhelm health services without the introduction of some lockdown measures. In such a scenario, it would be desirable for those people to form an accurate collective belief or an accurate collective prediction so that if, for example, public opinion were to be surveyed, the correct course of action would be supported. So it's with that kind of scenario in mind that I set up my research objective here to design, deploy, and evaluate algorithms that mediate online deliberation to elicit accurate collective judgments and forecasts. And importantly, these algorithms should work without access to ground truth knowledge, which we often don't have in the most pressing real-world scenarios. So ultimately, the view is for such algorithms to be integrated into existing recommender systems, but also they could be used to power entirely new purpose-built civic technologies. Now, how am I going to do this? How am I going to set out on this research objective? Well, the overarching approach is to take the logic of recommender systems that optimize for engagement, but instead try to optimize for collective intelligence. So first, we'll need to develop low-level metrics that quantify whether some content is likely to elicit a belief update from users that would benefit collective accuracy. And that's really not a straightforward task, right? It's hard to know what content is accurate or informative when we don't know what the ground truth actually is. In the forthcoming paper, I outlined some possibilities for how we might do this. but the general gist is that I'll be drawing from different bodies of literature, like research on wisdom of the crowd effects, which includes methods for spotting accurate individuals in a crowd of forecasters. And I'll also look at research on argumentation theory, which includes methods for evaluating the strength and structure of arguments. And then from there, the natural next step to evaluate whether those metrics are at all useful, in my eyes, is to run some experiments. Now, these experiments can take their shape in a variety of forms, as we've seen throughout this symposium. They could be simplistic lab-style tasks, to multiplayer online games, to full-fledged field experiments on existing platforms. But given the exploratory nature of this work, we're going to start simple. And so this is a schematic of an experiment I'm running with some colleagues at the Max Planck Institute in Berlin. And the idea here is to essentially study algorithmic amplification in a petri dish, right? So we'll have participants indicate their left-right political leaning and then proceed with the basic belief updating task of stating a belief, viewing some content, and then revising their belief. But importantly, we're going to manipulate what contents participants see by using different algorithmic approaches to sample and rank content from a larger inventory of content. So, for example, in one condition, we'll use an engagement-based approach and show participants the posts that previously received the most upvotes and downvotes in our pre-testing of the content. In another condition, we can use our newly developed metrics to show participants posts that we think are likely to increase belief accuracy. And then in our control condition, we're just going to randomly sample from that inventory. And I know in this symposium there's been a lot of passionate discussion about neutral baselines, and so I'd be keen to maybe pick that up in a conversation later. Once this is done, we'll look at the accuracy of participants' beliefs to see if, for instance, our new algorithmic ranking scheme led to more accurate judgments as compared to engagement-based ranking and the control group. Okay, so why am I doing all this? Why am I going through the hassle of these sort of gimmicky experiments? What key points am I hoping to convey through this work? Well, firstly, I'd like to argue that to realize the promises of social media and the internet at large, we need algorithms. As Arvind said in one of his posts, algorithms are not the enemy, but we should design them to align with our goals and values. And specifically through experimentation, I hope to show that we can design algorithms to curate content in ways that increase the objective accuracy of our beliefs, which seems intuitively good for society. And finally, a general point I hope to convey is that we should not only be researching how things are, but also how things could be. If we aren't satisfied with the status quo, we need to be able to present empirically sound alternatives. And I hope that through this work, I'm able to point towards one such alternative. And with that, I'd just like to thank many colleagues who helped shape these ideas. Philip, Stefan, Julian, Ulrika, thank you. Thank you to the Humboldt Foundation for supporting this work financially. And thank you to Arvind, Katie, and the Knight Institute for the opportunity to present. Thanks.
Thank you. This one working? Or yes, I think it is. I'll stay here to introduce our next panelist. Our next speaker is Kevin Feng. Kevin is a PhD student in the Human-Centered Design and Engineering Department at the University of Washington. His interests are at the intersection of social computing and human-centered machine learning. He's motivated by the observation that key stakeholders are increasingly at risk of agency loss from black boxed by powerful technologies in socio-technical systems. Kevin has a background in design as well, right? I think, and I think we'll see some of that in his talk today. And I would just recommend all these papers. I think there's a lot of wonderful details in all the papers that are going to be presented today. So I encourage you to go and look at those papers behind the beyond the 10-minute presentations. Kevin.
Great. Good morning, everyone. And unfortunately, the slides are a little bit misformatted, so sorry for the lack of contrast in the title there. That's supposed to be white. I'm not exactly sure what happened, so please bear with me for that. Yes. Okay, so thank you more for the introduction. And as you mentioned, I'm Kevin. I'm from the University of Washington. And from my bio, you may get the sense that I come from a human-computer interaction background, and that is indeed true, a mix of computer science and design. And in Ravi's talk yesterday, something that I really appreciated was him pointing out that design is indeed a very promising path going forward in terms of thinking about how platforms might mitigate some harmful aspects of amplification. And I definitely agree that there is indeed this rich design space ahead of us here, which makes me, a researcher in HCI, really excited about this as someone who is always thinking about the design and the building and the evaluation of human-centered systems. And that's very much in the spirit of the work that I'll be talking about today. And before diving in, I'll just say quickly that what I'll present today are the results of early findings and early design sketches. And so I'd love to hear all of your thoughts on this, either in the panel discussion as well as afterwards too. And let's see if this is working. Oh, okay, this is very poorly formatted. Sorry about that. Okay, hopefully this can still help me get through my presentation and deliver my points. So I'll start by talking a little bit about agency in the feed. And so Facebook launched their newsfeed in 2006, but before that, I would assume that what most users would do is go around individually to their friends' profiles and check for updates that way. And in that sense, they had a lot of agency. They could choose exactly who to view information from and exactly when to view that information. So when the feed launched, users traded off a little bit of agency for convenience. So they no longer had as much control, but like everything was just in the feed, ready for consumption. And so today we're kind of on the other end of the spectrum, where engagement feed algorithms act as these social architects for us. So they determine exactly what we should see, who to see, from whom we're seeing these types of content, and also when we're seeing these. And understandably, many users feel robbed of agency as a result. And because of this, many users have derived these algorithmic folk theories to try and reclaim some of that agency. And for those of you who are unfamiliar, folk theories are these informal conceptualizations about how these algorithms work. And they're studied quite extensively in HCI literature and beyond. Because even though these theories might not align necessarily with the technical realities of a system, they still play a big part in influencing user behavior on these platforms, and as a result, influencing the behaviors of the platforms themselves. And after deriving these folk theories, users would start to interact with the feed in these strategic ways. So one example would be watching a video over and over again to indicate to the algorithm that they are indeed interested in seeing similar types of content in the future, even though they might understand the video the first time through. And these strategic interactions can be thought of as teaching or training the algorithm, but I specifically like the framing of teaching because teaching is an inherent human ability in that we've all experienced it either formally through education systems or informally through giving instructions or receiving instructions or tutorials from others. And so what we might be interested in doing in social media systems is trying to shift more power over to users by designing feeds that really embrace and welcome these teaching interactions. Currently, teaching is more or less seen as a way as like a backdoor solution to try and counteract undesirable default behaviors of the feed. But what if we can actually embed these into a part of feeds themselves? And so the question here then becomes, oops, okay. But before we actually dive in, like the important question to ask here is, what do users even want to teach? Like, theoretically, if they were given a learnable agent, teach these agents in the context of social media feeds for curation purposes, and how would they go about doing that? And so to figure out these questions, we ran a design study, and you can, the full methodological details will be available in our full paper when it comes out, but I'll just talk about things on a very high level here. We ran an interactive design study with 24 participants across 4 platforms, where we asked them to share with us 10 pieces of content from their social media feeds, and then curate their ideal feed by re-ranking the content that they provided. And we asked them to provide kind of rationale for the position of each of these posts in their ideal feed through these templates, which we call signals. And here's an example. So the first one is the default template, and the second one is an example that the user filled in during the study. And essentially what these signals try to do is elicit what participants actually find valuable within a post and why they find it valuable. And after the activity, we also conducted a short post-activity interview with participants just to get their thoughts on and experiences on social media feeds a little bit more generally. And we came away with many findings, but I'll just highlight, just for the sake of time, a couple here. And I'll also talk about some design implications that go with those findings just to see how the two, just so that you can see how the two fit together. And so the first one is this. So many users prioritized people in their social media experiences, but they also noticed this content-first shift in the way that platforms were recommending content to them. And the most notable example here is that 4 out of the 6 participants who were Instagram users in our sample actually did not see any content from close friends or family or anyone else they really cared about with the posts in their study. And I really like this quote here. This was from a participant who realized this during the study itself, who said that, what a horrible development. How have I only just noticed? And this really points to this frog boiling effect. And I think there's a really interesting design opportunity here, which is allowing users to teach more granular preferences to the platform. So currently on Twitter or Facebook today, if you were to go and like a post, what is it that you're actually liking? Is it the author, or is it something that they said in the post, the keyword, or maybe the general topic, or hashtag, etc.? There's no way to actually explicitly provide these more granular preferences. And so here is an interface that we sketched out that might be able to help with this. And we really took inspiration from exploded views in 3D modeling here, where this view can, within this view, you can see kind of the individual components of the 3D model. And so we thought if every time you say go like a post on social media, and it can explode into these individual components, you can then go through and pick out the components, say like, I want to see more of this specific component or less of these specific things, as a more explicit act of teaching and providing more granular feedback. And we also found that there is little support for organizing archived content, even though archival is something that participants engaged in quite a lot, saving content for later consumption. And so, for example, this participant here actually just sends content to others as a way of managing their archival. And I think there's a really missed opportunity here because archives can be a really good set of examples, or you can think of it as a teaching curriculum, when teaching preferences to this algorithmic agent. And so what if we shift to an alternative approach of designing the feed, where instead of just scrolling and allowing the stream of information to flow by, what if we redesigned the feed to foster these more intentional and goal-oriented interactions through archiving and curating meaningful content? And I think a fitting metaphor here is a Spotify playlist. So one core interaction on Spotify is for users to go and find music and then save it to individual playlists. So what might a content playlist look like? So we've sketched out an example over here. And although this concept might look quite simple, we can start to imagine kind of the additional interactions that we can build on top of this. Say, for example, attaching user-written goals to specific content playlists, or syncing playlists with, say, certain calendar invites or calendar events, and just in general steering future recommendations with these playlists. And before I end, I just want to address this one elephant in the room here, which is that these large for-profit corporate platforms will still likely be the primary providers of our social media experiences going forward. And they're not really, motivated to consider these more teaching-based approaches if there are no incentives to do so. So we think that there are actually indeed incentives here, and to illustrate, I'll talk very briefly about ads. And so ads appeared quite frequently in our user study because a lot of the posts that the participants submitted to us were of ads. And participants mainly disliked ads, not surprisingly, but it was mainly due to their irrelevance and low quality rather than just the idea of having ads on the platform itself. And so an example here in the kind of first quote there, a non-US citizen kept receiving ads for the US forces and they were wondering why they got that. But on the other hand, ads can be genuinely useful. So one of our participants did casual part-time modeling, and actually through a local ad, she landed a contract at an agency. And so overall, bad ads can be harmful to both users and platforms. Platforms' reputations might dip, and that's certainly not something they're interested in. And users also don't want to be exposed to these types of low-quality content. And so we believe that a higher emphasis on teaching can actually result in higher quality ads on these platforms. So if platforms served ads based on explicitly provided signals, rather than implicitly learned ones, ads might be more relevant, and users, if they have a clear idea of what they're teaching these agents, then they can better understand why they got these ads, making ads more transparent and trustworthy as a result, and improving overall platform experience. And just to, I'm out of time unfortunately, but just to quickly recap here, and the text should be white, so once again, sorry about that. So this is like a high-level summary of what's in our paper, but the one thing I'll highlight here is that throughout all of this, we realize that the most exciting opportunities are still yet to come. There's such a rich space ahead of us, and I'd love to continue to talk about questions of where we can go from here. And so hopefully that's something that we can do in the panel discussions and also the discussions afterwards. But for now, I'll turn it back to Moore. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kevin. We'll move on from two papers that kind of look at the design of systems to papers that look at algorithms and their impact, I would say. So first up, we have Ben Kaiser. Ben is a PhD candidate in computer science at Princeton at the Center of Information Technology Policy. His research looks at usable security, privacy, and information integrity. Very interesting work to be presented. Looking forward to it. And make sure to start your timer.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, let's find out what these slides look like. So there's been a lot of conversation at this conference the last few days about sort of how limited our real-world knowledge is about how platform design and algorithms affect society. And in particular, not only real-world evidence, but sort of direct causal evidence measured in real-world settings. There was something Yoel said at on his panel yesterday, about how platforms do have some of this evidence, right? They've done A/B tests, randomly deployed interventions and other types of design changes and new features, and measured how these affect internal platform metrics like exposure and engagement. But the people who don't have this information is the public and regulators. So there's kind of an evidence gap here between what platforms know about how their design and algorithms affect public interest outcomes and what everyone else knows. And so one example of an area where this is really having sort of a deleterious effect on our ability to create evidence-informed policy is around countering the spread of misinformation online. So, despite really intense public and regulatory interest in this question for like 7 or 8 years, we still don't really know whether platforms are amplifying misinformation, whether they can effectively de-amplify it, or whether there are other types of countermeasures that can effectively reduce engagement with misinformation. So the state of play on misinformation is that platforms are definitely doing a lot. They've deployed dozens of different informative interventions, so things like fact checks, media literacy tips, labels, warnings. They've also done quite a bit of content removal, banning accounts, especially around coordinated disinformation campaigns where they do targeted investigations and sort of large-scale removal. And then they're also using reduction interventions, I'll call them de-amplification, where they might demote content in ranked feeds, or they might exclude it from being promoted or even discovered via search or other platform discovery mechanisms. So this is sort of a high-level taxonomy of what platforms are doing: remove, reduce, and inform. And again, we don't really know if any of these interventions are working in practice. And we also don't know what the comparative effects are and what the trade-offs might be, both in terms of the effects and sort of the normative outcomes. So what we'd really like to know is when these different kinds of interventions are deployed on platforms, how do they affect user behavior and engagement with misinformation? I think this is a pretty key question. So there are two potential sources of evidence on this question. One is platforms themselves. As I said, they do run A/B tests. They do large-scale descriptive studies, sort of looking at sort of quantitative evidence on what's happening. But they're really not sharing much of this data, and they're really not sharing it in detail. We see a lot of sort of cherry-picked data coming out of platforms. You can see an example here where Mark Zuckerberg's talking about warnings they deployed for COVID. He cites a 95% effectiveness rate, which anybody who studies this area knows is unlikely. Depends on the measurement approach, obviously, but there's a lot of context lacking to be able to interpret the data that platforms are putting out. So what they have put out has really emphasized the informative interventions, things like fact checks, warnings, media literacy tips. And they've also talked a bit about their removal interventions, but they really haven't talked about reduction and de-amplification. There's really little to no quantitative data about sort of how these interventions are deployed or what the effects are. And so this has led a lot of people to believe that informative interventions are highly effective. Things like warnings, inoculation, fact checks, et cetera. There was just an article in the New York Times a couple weeks ago pointing out that misinformation engagement on Facebook is down significantly over the last 4 years, and it cites fact checks and media literacy trainings as the main cause for that decrease. But there actually isn't evidence from platforms to support that claim. So the other potential source of information is scholars, independent research. And there's been an extensive amount of work, some presented at this conference and conducted by scholars at this conference. This body of research has really extensively studied informative interventions. So we did a literature review for this paper. We found over 270 studies that are looking at the causal effects of informative interventions. And broadly, what this body of literature shows is that these interventions do have significant effects on important outcomes: users' ability to discern misinformation, the accuracy of their beliefs, their self-reported likelihood of sharing this information if they come across it on social media. And they find sort of effect sizes that are in the small to medium range, like 20 to 40% of a standard deviation. The challenge is that without platform collaboration, there are sort of major hurdles to moving beyond the methods that are currently in practice. So we see a lot of laboratory studies. You might show users screenshots of posts and ask them about their beliefs or their self-reported behavioral intentions. And these are really important methods. They have benefits over field methods in a lot of key ways. They can control things a lot more than you can in a field setting. They can be more imaginative. They can test things that platforms are not ready to deploy in the field or that aren't even capable of being deployed on platforms as they currently exist. And I think there are also fewer ethical concerns with doing a laboratory study versus randomly deploying interventions to real users. But there are also some negative trade-offs, and in particular, they might be around external validity. It's hard to know when you study these things in a laboratory, whether those effects actually translate to how users will really behave in the real world when they see these interventions. And behavioral outcomes are one area where this trade-off really exists. And the other thing is that it's very difficult to study reduction interventions in a laboratory setting if you're sort of not connected to the actual algorithm, the actual feeds, that are showing users content in practice. You would have to sort of simulate these things, and again, you come up against some validity concerns here. So our study is the first real-world comparison of the behavioral effects of a few different types of common misinformation interventions that platforms are deploying in practice. We deployed this study in collaboration with DuckDuckGo, which is a privacy technology company that operates a search engine. They have very strong guarantees against user tracking, very strong guarantees on user privacy. We adhere to all of this in our study. They are quite large scale, not quite as large as Google, but they do serve about 100 million queries daily, so qualifies as a major platform. And what we did for this study was we designed 3 interventions to simulate common interventions that other major platforms are using. So one of these was information panels. This is a feed level or a page level informative intervention. So rather than being attached to a specific result or piece of content, it appears at the top of a search results page where known misinformation results appeared on the results page. So these have fact checks or other types of informative messages that are designed to help users resist misinformation or avoid it. We also deployed a related articles module, which is a form of amplifying trusted news to the very top of the SERP. So you would get a carousel of news stories above all the other results. And then we also tested some downranking interventions. And we collected anonymized data about how these interventions affected the types of results that users engaged with. So did it make them more or less likely to click valid news results or misinformation results or other types of results, or to leave search results pages without selecting any results at all. And we also measured engagement with the interventions themselves. So I apologize for the giant table of numbers here, but I tried to highlight the sort of key findings. The main thing that we found here is that the de-amplification interventions, as you might expect, were incredibly effective. The stronger de-amplification intervention we tested reduced engagement with misinformation by 50%. So a very large, very significant effect. We also found that this related news module, which is a form of amplification intervention, was very effective at increasing engagement with news. So it did not decrease the amount of news results that people selected in the organic results, but it added on all the times that they clicked on news results in the module itself. So the overall increase here was about 40%. So these 2 interventions were very effective and showed significant effects. The informative interventions we tested broadly did not show significant effects on user behavior. So the key takeaways I want to highlight here are that, again, these amplification and de-amplification interventions are very effective, maybe among the most effective ways that are sort of currently in practice to reduce engagement with misinformation and increase engagement with credible sources of news. Our findings are somewhat in contrast with this large body of laboratory research that suggests that these informative interventions are significantly and highly effective. I think that to some extent, platform secrecy has really hindered public and regulatory understanding on these issues. They've done things like public statements, transparency reports, data sharing agreements. But again, I think a lot of people have sort of misbeliefs about what actually works in these scenarios. And these types of co-design studies between platforms and scholars are potentially a very powerful way to shed light on these issues. I think that the types of one-off studies like we did here are not necessarily scalable. They rely on special relationships with platforms, platform goodwill, lucky timing to some degree. But the general approach of trying to get researchers to co-design studies with platform, co-design data collection, is actually a very powerful way to investigate these kinds of issues. And a lot of times platforms will cite privacy concerns as a reason they can't do these types of studies, but in partnering with a very privacy conscious company, I think we demonstrated that it's actually possible to get around those issues with some sort of careful research design and careful data collection. So thank you to my collaborators, DuckDuckGo, my colleagues at Princeton CITP, and to the Knight Foundation, Arvind and Katie, for organizing this great event.
Thanks. I'll just add that your findings are not in contrast to research work from my lab. We haven't published yet, but we show that trust evaluations of search results do not change when you have informational, any banners on top. Interesting. Great. Our next speaker, Angela Lai. He's a PhD candidate at NYU, the Center of Data Science, and a graduate research associate at the NYU Center for Social Media and Politics. Research interests include natural language processing, network analysis, and political and social behavior, and its interactions with social media. Should present research work that already grabbed a few headlines.
All right, thank you for the kind introduction. Hi everyone, I'm here today presenting joint work with Megan Brown, Jim Bisbee, Richard Bonneau, Jonathan Nagler, and Joshua Tucker from NYU Center for Social Media and Politics on how YouTube recommends content to real people. This works. As I'm sure many of you are aware, there's been a lot of concern over YouTube's potential ability to radicalize users by leading them down rabbit holes toward increasingly extreme content. The thing is, a lot of those stories are based on anecdotal evidence, while much of the existing research in this area often leans on automated browsers or observational data like user watch history. So we try to bridge that gap by recruiting real users and controlling for user choice. We're interested in the following research questions. We want to look at whether YouTube appears to contribute to echo chambers, rabbit holes, and system-wide ideological bias, where we're defining those concepts here using the political ideology of a video. And I'll define those a little more concretely as I get to the results. I guess we're starting off facing a couple of major challenges already, right? First off, how do we isolate for the effects of the recommendation algorithm while studying real people? Normally, when you watch a YouTube video, you might search up a result and then choose the next video you want to watch from one of the recommended videos on the side. Here, we assign users to a traversal task where they install a browser extension, so there's no platform collaboration required here, and we give them a random seed video to start off on, and we assign them a rule where we say, click the ith recommendation every time. So they'll click on the ith recommendation, then they click on the ith recommendation associated with that video, and they repeat this for a total of 20 steps. We also collect some additional survey information, and we actually use some of this post-election attitudes info for a different study. But so that's how we try to address that challenge. The next challenge we face is estimating the ideology of YouTube videos at a large scale. So I won't go too much into the details here. We do have a separate paper on this if you want to read more about the method, just to give a really high-level overview. In the same way that others have estimated ideology as a latent variable by looking at how, let's say, legislators vote on bills or how interest groups rate politicians, we look at how subreddits choose videos. And ultimately, we end up with ideology estimates that we can then use to train a natural language processing model on video text metadata, like the video title and description, and we ultimately get a model that can estimate the ideology of any political YouTube video as long as we have its text metadata. And so the key benefit here is that we get a more granular measure that is scalable and fairly cheap to update. We go through a number of validation exercises in the paper, and I just included a couple of them here. So first, on the left, I'm showing the mean ideology scores per channel plotted against categorical channel labels from existing work. And one thing I want to note here is that you can see we get a little bit of a finer grained picture of what these channels might look like. So for example, in this left category, we have one group of more progressive channels, this lump on the left, and then a group of more mainstream channels. Additionally, we show the distribution of video ideology for some relatively well-known popular channels. So now that we have our survey data and our ideology estimates, I'm just showing you here an example of an empirical traversal for one user. As we go along the axis, we're going further down the traversal, and then the ideology is just on the y-axis, where the user is moving along the videos outlined in black. And we start off on a seed video, and then we show the recommendations associated with that video the ideology of the recommendations on the next step. So in this case, the user seems to be moving between a pretty diverse set of recommendations. In contrast, here I have someone who, if they're conservative, we might define them as landing in an echo chamber. So here let me define what I mean by echo chambers and rabbit holes. We say that a user lands in an echo chamber if they are only shown content that is ideologically congruent with their beliefs. Rabbit holes, however, are a function of time. Over time, the user might be led toward an echo chamber, toward videos that are ideologically narrow and ideologically extreme. This can be on the left or the right. So in this case, we might say that this is an example of both echo chambers and rabbit holes. However, we naturally need to look at all of our data. While these illustrations are instructive, we want to look at this overall. So first up, we look at the question of echo chambers. We look at the ideology of recommended videos and compare it with the self-reported ideology of our survey respondents. What I want to highlight here is that the distributions are very similar. However, we do observe a rightward shift in the mean of the ideologies of the recommended videos as you move from extreme liberal to extreme conservative. However, I will note that while this difference is statistically significant, it is quite small in magnitude. Next up, we look at the question of rabbit holes, where users who are liberal are in blue, moderates in gray, and conservatives in red. And we essentially look at how the distribution of the ideologies of the recommendations they get change as they move further down the traversal. Once again, we don't see much of a shift nor much of a difference between liberals, moderates, or conservatives. We do see, once again, this slight shift toward the right. Once again, it is small magnitude, but consistent with what we saw on the last slide, right? Okay. Right. And finally, we look at system-wide ideological bias, which we define as, regardless of your ideology or what videos you're watching, do we find that YouTube tends to push you toward, does YouTube tend to have a certain ideological slant to its recommendations? So we do that here by looking at liberals and conservatives, so just, in red and blue, and if they start off on a liberal seed, a moderate seed, or a conservative seed, what happens to the ideology of their recommendations over time? Sort of consistent with the results that I showed previously, we find that there is a little bit of a shift toward the right. Just once again, small in magnitude, but it is there. And we also find that there is some narrowing in the variance of the ideologies of the recommended videos that they see. So they are getting a little bit narrower and shifting a little more to the right as they click on more videos. So just to sum up our results, right? So we do find that recommended content varies with user ideology, that there's a little bit of a decrease in ideological variance and some shift to the right as users continue to follow the recommendation algorithm. However, I think there are a couple of significant caveats with this type of work, right? I've presented sort of a methodology or a framework for studying the recommendation algorithm at different periods of time. Of course, YouTube's recommendation algorithm is ever changing. Importantly, I also have to note here that we're focusing on ideologically extreme content rather than other forms of extremism like violent content. Also, our results don't mean, of course, that YouTube can't be a tool for radicalization or that it's not full of extremist content. That could very well be the case. It just might be that the algorithm is less of a driver in that radicalization than people sharing content and kind of pushing others in social media communities toward certain videos. But of course, that's hard to say. And that is the end of my talk. Thank you so much to the Knight Foundation, Arvind and Katie, for organizing this great symposium. Looking forward to the panel discussion.
Thank you. Thanks all of you. We have time for discussion, so I'm going to start with a couple of questions and then We'll open it up for audience and remote. So for the audience here, there's a mic right there. You can also submit the question with the QR code. The audience online, I think there's a Google form they can go to, so feel free to submit the questions. So maybe first maybe a quick, some of the approaches that we've seen in your talks and in the symposium so far, right? We had the informational approaches. We killed those. Those don't work. They may work. I think we have evidence that they don't have a lot of impact, maybe or maybe not still important to include. We've seen nudges. Right? We've seen user active controls, like the one that Kevin outlined. Maybe Yoel yesterday talked about the defaults work, but maybe there's some other ideas. We've seen platform changes and algorithmic changes that may or may not be needed or evident. And then there are new platforms, perhaps, that Jason points out. Maybe we should start from scratch with new platforms and algorithms. So maybe for each of you, where would you go first? Like, what's the one thing? Don't tell me, all of the above, we need to do all of them. Where's the one thing you would start to change our information ecosystem today, whether yourselves or going to the platforms or going to regulators?
I can maybe chime in. Of course, I want to say both. I want to do everything. But the thing I'd like to see most, which was articulated nicely in a recent article by Ethan Zuckerman and covered in the New York Times, I think, is the future of social media should be smaller and denser, right? I think we often forget that this all-in-one platform like Twitter or Facebook even is weird. Like, it's weird that I'm having conversations with my coworkers in the same room as my political representatives, as the same rooms as my high school friends, right? There should be space for cat memes and mindless scrolling. People like that, but I think that space shouldn't be the same space we have discussions about science and important political discussions. So I'd like to see more variety in the platforms we have available to us, and we can have sort of more purpose-built communities, because that's what we have as human beings in the real world, so to speak, the offline world. And so I'd like to see social media design go in that direction.
Yeah, I suppose we could just go down the line here. Maura, I know you mentioned, don't say all of the above, but I'll just do that in a very indirect way here. So I think, there, at least from my HCI instinct, my instinct here is, towards user empowerment and giving more affordances to the user. And Yoel mentioned yesterday that, defaults are very powerful, and I definitely, that's very much true. And I think, although that might be just an implication of the designs of platforms, in that these defaults are usually hidden away in some menu that no one really accesses. And so something that I've been increasingly interested in, and we kind of explore in the paper as well, is how do we bring these defaults more into the user interface in front of users, so that they can just constantly reflect on this every once in a while. And one of the things that we talk about in the paper is this idea of instead of the infinite scroll where everything continually loads, what if things are still loaded in batches, but they're done in a very intentional way with breaks in between, so that users can use those breaks to, say, like revisit some of their settings, or to specify how the next batch should change from the previous batch going forward. And these interface changes, of course, tie in a lot with some of the underlying algorithmic changes as well. So if we design these new affordances that are able to capture these new forms of user feedback, then we can perhaps use those forms of feedback in the underlying algorithm. On the other hand, if we design new algorithms that we're interested in testing out, and these might be able to benefit from these new kinds of user interactions, we will then need to modify the user interface. So I think a lot of these, it's not like a question of either or, but they're very much entangled.
I agree with the sentiment that design changes and sort of centering users is important, but that's not quite what my research examines, so I'll maybe talk about something that I think follows on from my findings. We see that de-amplification and reduction works. I'm not going to say we should be reducing or de-amplifying more, but I do think there are ways to improve the quality of those interventions. one of the hard things is figuring out what to de-amplify, right? Especially for smaller platforms don't have the resources to do the level of investigation that large platforms might. Platforms need more information about sources of harmful content, not just misinformation, but other categories as well. I think it would be good if there was more mandated transparency for these platforms around these issues. I think it would also be good if there was more cover for platforms because they're subject to political attacks from many different directions when they intervene algorithmically. So, sort of thinking about the idea that there's strength in numbers, I like the idea of sort of a clearinghouse of data for, again, for misinformation, for other types of harmful content, labeled data, something like ground truth. This would be data contributed by platforms based on their own internal investigations, potentially contributed by other sources as well, certainly civil society groups and scholars and potentially governments in some capacities. I think this would help level the playing field for small and emerging platforms. I think it would increase the consistency of what people see across the web, which would also be helpful for ensuring that people don't just for ensuring that the information gathered by one platform isn't just used for their own benefit, but actually benefits users across their various experiences.
Yeah, I think, okay. I think that's super important. And hopefully this doesn't come across as like a cop-out answer, but I think that one of the most important things is improving digital literacy, because I think that the incentives for news outlets or websites to pop up and maybe promote misinformation or even just really sensational content is always going to be there in some form. I do think that there's some natural human tendency to be drawn to those things. So of course we need algorithmic amplification studies and regulations, but I think there's always going to be new platforms proliferating with like different approaches to that. And I think in my mind, the most important thing is just making sure that people learn how to judge content from an early age, just because so many of us live like so much of our lives online, which is of course a much like larger scale and institutional change, but I think that's really one of the most like important changes that would need to be made.
I think maybe related is the question of the achieving scale for all these interventions, and in particular, is this a losing proposition to change those systems? Because we have systems that grew to this scale because they were so good at manipulating our engagement, our attention, and they got to it because of our human tendency. So now can we either create systems from scratch that can compete and achieve scale without offering all these benefits, or vice versa? Can we now rein in those things and hope that they people keep using them, even though, I don't know, the content is less alarming or less engaging?
I can maybe speak to the issue of designing new platforms and whether they'll take off, right? I mean, obviously, predicting those sorts of things is sort of a fool's errand. I don't think we can say whether a new type of design won't be engaging for users, right? Like, anecdotally, I think several of us in this room would like to go to a platform and engage if we thought that it's going to help us form accurate beliefs. And I think whether informative content is actually less engaging is still an open empirical question that hasn't really been dug into enough. And then in the space of civic technologies where people are designing these platforms that are sort of the good for you platforms, there are some signs of hope, right? Like people know about Polis, Decidem, and various other examples that get good press and attention, albeit probably not enough attention. So that's not really an answer, but I think there's reason to be optimistic there. And then I always sort of think about the parallel to our food choices, right? Like, I'll pay more for food that tastes worse because it's healthier for me. So why can't we apply the same sort of thinking to our social media platforms and maybe use something that's less intuitively engaging if I know that it's not going to lead me into a rabbit hole echo chamber or some dark place?
Yeah, I agree with that optimism, and also with Angela's point that there are opportunities for upstream like education that can help here. I think there is a growing understanding of the costs of engagement-based ranking and also surveillance and personalization and sort of these related issues. So I think there is actually movement in the right direction, but the design and the user experience have to be there first, right? These like differentiators are only going to matter if people actually want to use these platforms, find them easy to use. I think there was a mention yesterday about Mastodon being sort of a promising platform, but user experience challenges it really inhibiting the immediate growth there. So design, as Kevin has pointed out, is really pretty key. I also think there's an opportunity for some regulation to level the playing field here. I think we see very strong network effects that keep people locked into the platforms they're on. It's very difficult to leave Facebook, even if you want to, if you get sort of crucial information there because all of your friends are there, your networks are there. So I think that something like data portability requirements could be a good way to help new platforms get off the ground.
Yeah, I guess just to chime in here with kind of a broader, higher level question in response to Moore's question. So whenever there's this desire or goal to scale, I always wonder whether it's like, why scale? Is scale really necessary? In social media platforms where we actually want, say, more specialized communities and smaller conversations, I think it's perfectly fine if things are at a smaller scale and it's actually a better user experience for the scale to be smaller. But on the other hand, if we actually want to leverage, do more leveraging of collective intelligence, where the scale actually is meaningful in some way, then perhaps there can be some design choices that are put in from the from the very beginning, taking scale into consideration. Say some users might be have only read-only authority, and some can post content or whatever. And that way, perhaps there can be less of these undesirable effects of amplification. So thinking about scale and the thinking critically about why we need scale, I think that can probably be something that can be incorporated way earlier in conversations about platform design, and that can in turn influence some of these design interventions, as Ben mentioned, that can influence the way these platforms actually are used in the end.
We'll take one from the audience.
Thank you all. I found so many of these ideas generative in terms of taking a broader view of what we could optimize for, whether it's truth seeking or more user agency, or also putting all of that on a better evidence base. So yeah, thank you for that. I have a question.
Also, introduce yourself before you ask a question.
I'm a software engineer. I recommend assistance. I have a question for Kevin on effort. I'm curious. Teaching is something that's very effortful, and so I expect people to not always be in the mood to teach. Maybe only a subset of people to want to teach. And I'm curious, even if you design affordances that are really front and center, that allow people to state their explicit preferences, what are we doing about all those people who will not? About maybe the 90% of people who, I guess this is a scale question, who will not tell us about their explicit preferences. It seems very hard to make an argument with some ML engineer working on engagement-based ranking, where you get to surveil somebody's milliseconds. They look at each piece of content. Why your explicit preferences, which are so sparsely offered, would be a better way of aligning a feed with somebody's preferences. So yeah, I'm curious, how are you thinking about effort? Did that come up as you were designing this user interface?
Yeah, for sure. That is definitely something that we've thought about a lot. And in some of the HCI literature, so there's this whole interaction framework that actually informed quite a lot of this work called interactive machine teaching. And a lot of the machine teaching interfaces that were introduced in some of the HCI space, they were very effortful in that their kind of main objective was to basically get the user to explain these very detailed concepts in these cognitively loaded user sessions. And so we realized that for teaching to be effective in the feed, we would need to try and lower that in some way. And to some extent, I think we've lowered it a little bit, but yes, I totally agree that effort is still a concern when it comes to, given how quickly information is consumed on social media nowadays. I will say that in our study, we also found out that, user agency is a double-edged sword, right? Like in some scenarios, users want to engage in this more kind of goal-oriented, focused interaction. But in other scenarios, they just want to, turn off their brain and just scroll. And, mindless scrolling can be, useful and nice in some scenarios, just, not all the time, of course. So I think there's real potential for these kinds of teaching interactions to exist in, these like modes, if you will, like browsing modes, and maybe the non-teaching interfaces can also exist in another mode, and users can switch between these modes depending on what kinds of browsing interactions that they would want. But yeah, I agree that if we were to implement these teaching-based approaches across all social media platforms, that might not benefit user experience because a lot of users are interested in some of these more like relaxed approaches and kind of just letting the algorithm handle things, but only some of the time.
Thank you. Let me take one from the online world, and it's a question specifically for Angela, but I'll expand it a little bit maybe. So the question reads, does YouTube push center-right videos just because there are more of them? People often say that US is a largely center-right country, so if so, lots of center-right videos would be expected. And I guess the general question, I think something both of you touched on, Jason and Ben, how do we think about balancing or ranking content? You alluded to the question of saying what is misinformation. You setting up a place where there's right-leaning and left-leaning users, but we know that users and content is multidimensional, have many different sets of preferences. It's not always, obviously, not always a dichotomy. It's always a range of where you are on each of these dimensions. So, Angela, how are you thinking about these first, and then others?
Yeah, I think it's a little hard to say whether center-right videos make up the majority of like YouTube's political videos, just because we don't know the entire universe of YouTube videos, I guess. But I think that's a good point, and that could definitely be something. I guess that does sort of lead to Moore's point, right, about then does the platform have a responsibility to try to push you toward like a middle rather than just the majority of the videos. But I think that's definitely something we can try to look into more.
Yeah, I don't have much to add on this topic. I mean, the right-left one-dimensional thing is a convenient experimental tool for me. I'm researching in Europe, and we still lean on that, and we're using American participants, right?
What a great lab we are.
Yeah, it's a living experiment, right? All I will sort of add to this, which is sort of tangential, is that a lot of the content online isn't political at all. So when you try to shove it into some kind of, ideology classifier and it spits out some ideology, it's like, is it meaningful if it is just a cat meme? Mm-hmm. And so I think when we're doing experiments and researching stuff, we dive straight into this ideological battlefield without realizing that most of the content online is not ideological and not political. So it's something I think as a research community we should accept more.
Yeah, that's an important point, that political content is a very small sliver of what most people look for and engage with online. So and misinformation is then like a tiny sliver of that tiny sliver. So important not to overinflate, I think, the importance of these like really tiny sort of absolute scale problems. But at the same time, to the extent that these problems are concentrated in certain accounts, certain users, certain settings, like those are the most valuable opportunities for intervention. So I think, yeah, that's I don't really want to get into the what is misinformation question. That could take up the rest of the panel. So I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, just to add on, we did look at the watch histories of survey respondents in like different contexts, and it did support, Jason, your point that most of the content users are looking at does not fall in the political category at all.
Mhm. And what did you find, Kevin, in your study when you had controls? Was there any political controls? If so, if you think you need them, and how would you add them?
Yeah, so using our approach, I guess users can configure political controls if they want to, but if that's not something they're interested in doing, then they have the option to set controls for other things or just not have any political controls at all. So I think it's, yeah, really up to them.
Let's take one from Richard.
Thanks. I'm Dick Reisman, and quickly before I get to my question, a comment on Kevin's point. If you think about these systems as bicycles for the mind, why aren't we able to steer them wherever we want, whenever we want? So the mood-related thing seems kind of a central thing. But okay, so the question is, user signals that are implicit seems to me to be the huge opportunity. It's going to be hard to do without the platform's cooperation. But I've been writing for a long time about reputation-based algorithms that work similar to Google PageRank, where you use human judgment. They used, the webmaster putting links in as an editorial judgment of which sites were useful. You can do the same things with likes, shares, comments to build reputation, use an eigenvalue-based number to get a reputation, and then you can cluster that automatically into communities, subject domains, whatever. Also, if you enable people to build groups and social networks, then you can use their natural implicit clustering so that you can build reputations, drawn from New York Times readers versus Fox viewers, and use that as a way to do ranking. So I'm curious whether anybody's, and by the way, Jeff Allen sort of was the only person I've seen who really advocated this also when he was at Facebook that leaked, and he's now at the Integrity Institute. But has anybody seen this? Has anybody, do you think it's useful?
So I think this is closest to you, Jason. Maybe you should.
First, cool. I would like to know more.
Sure.
I am not familiar. That's a short answer. But I guess the stuff I am familiar with is the general idea of identifying communities and topics through some kind of embedding procedure, right? Now, as far as I understand, that is what existing recommender systems are tending to do. But I would be totally interested in seeing how, first off, how different is that from the stuff you're describing in the first place? But both seem valid.
Yeah, it's not based on content analysis,
Yeah.
at least not to a significant extent. And I think the platforms do it to some degree for ad targeting, but they don't do it for the user's benefit.
Yeah, it's a great point. Yeah.
Let's keep going in the audience.
Thank you. My name is Wilson. I'm from the private sector. I put in a question there, but I want to give it more context. So the question is for Jason. I'm really interested in collective intelligence, and there's some research going on at Carnegie Mellon and MIT dealing with that. But I was wondering if you can integrate the ideas of homophilia, social capital, especially bridging social capital, collective intelligence. Are you doing that kind of research? I'm really, really interested in that, and I'll be sending you a lot of emails and wait for that. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great point, and I don't want to go into it too much because I know we've got Luke in the audience who's going to be presenting stuff in the next section on bridging systems, which I think is more directly addressing your question. I will add my 2 cents to this idea, and it's that bridging systems and bridging divides and breaking down echo chambers and finding common ground is super important, especially for certain tasks like preference aggregation, where the goal is sort of to, okay, here you've got these people with super diverse and incommensurable preferences. How can you find the option that is the most agreed upon across the group? So in that case, like consensus seems like the right objective. But when it comes to things where there is an objective ground truth, like making predictions, and even many of the problem-solving tasks we have where we're picking what is the best alternative from a set of possibilities, there's a predictive element there. And in those contexts, diversity of opinion and letting those sort of echo chambers that might be socially viewed as detrimental, there's a benefit to that. I mean, there's research from the sort of domain of animal behavior that looks at like schooling fish and ants and stuff, and they show how modular behavior, so letting animals sort of stick it within their cluster, that contributes to a global sort of behavior that's beneficial for the entirety of the population, even though they're only responding to their local communities. So while it sounds great to break down echo chambers and we should all be in one room, there is some benefit to letting people, you know, develop their own opinions rather than just homogenizing right away.
Thank you for the wonderful talks. I have a question for Angela about how you interpret your effect sizes. You had a sequence of 20 videos, if I remember right. So I'm thinking about a typical user who might watch, 10 videos per day, and over the course of a few years, that's probably going to be a few tens of thousands of videos. So is it plausible that in that context, the effect size is, 1,000 times what you measured, or am I horribly misunderstanding how to interpret this?
No, that's a great question. So like, if we expanded the time scale, would we see a larger effect size? Is that the thought?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we didn't observe much of a difference, like from around the 10th traversal step onward toward the 20th. Like, I think it started to get kind of static at a certain point. But I am not sure if I can extrapolate that to like, over the course of like years and looking at like different videos, and over time, does that like little center-right shift eventually accumulate? But at least in the context of our study, we didn't find that this was just that it was like steadily increasing. It was a little more, it was not as linear, I guess.
And maybe to follow on that, maybe even a more difficult question to answer is, what is the impact on the user, not just in the videos that they watch? What is the impact? How do they shift? How do we know if they shifted the ideology, or went to vote more readily, or did not go to vote more readily, or for all of your studies, right? How do we understand the actual impact on the real world rather than on the online behavior?
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's something I can answer from our study, just because we didn't look at what the users. I think because we like assigned the users to, undertake pretty artificial behavior, so they weren't necessarily like actually actively engaging with the videos or anything. So at least for that study, I think it's a little hard to say.
Yeah, maybe I can just chime in really quickly. I will say that like traditional, more quantitative measures, I think this is where things really break down, because for impact and things like satisfaction on a longer time scale, I think we would have to rely on measures that are probably stemming more from human judgment rather than quantitative measures. So things like, sensation of agency and whether that increased or decreased and how that changed, like user satisfaction, very broadly defined, and things like that. So I think the space is, still very blurry, and there's a lot of kind of like human judgments that should be harvested to evaluate this.
Justin?
Justin Hendricks from Tech Policy Press. So we could retitle this panel, Empirical Look at User Behavior on Hyper-Capitalist Platforms, right? How do you isolate the business incentives of the major platforms you study when you think about, the effects that you're looking at? We've got now more than a decade of these things being optimized to be money machines. We're not talking about, the internet as a sort of public good here.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a huge problem. We could just burn it all down, I guess. I mean, it's tough,
Headline
right?
for the panel.
Yeah, I mean, there needs to be new business models, is the short answer. I mean, there is sort of a cynical take, which is that engagement and making things like intuitively desirable or enjoyable for the user immediately is the only way to have a business. But I mean, like I said with the food analogy, right? Like, we appreciate fair trade coffee. I will pay more for a healthy, kind of crappy tasting granola bar instead of the sugary Twinkie because I know it's better for me. So I think there needs to be sort of a reckoning with the business models that we have now. I don't have the answer for where we go next, but this is sort of a point that I am not directly conveying through the work I'm doing now, but I'm hoping to sort of hint at, right? Like, we don't have to just make tweaks to the UI on Twitter and Facebook for ad revenue if it suits them. We don't have to just do field experiments looking at things that they're doing to know which one of those things they're willing to do is the best. We can burn it all down.
I suppose, yeah, just to offer another idea here, I've been actually finding a little bit of hope in franchises, like the franchise model of business, which holds actually many parallels with the organizational structure of Fediverse platforms such as Mastodon, in that there's kind of this one central operational framework, but then it's broken up into these kind of separate branches where you have local instances, or like local stores in the case of franchises, that cater to kind of local needs. And franchises have been shown to be flourishing under capitalistic models, capitalistic economies, sorry. And so to some extent, I suppose this is one potential direction that we can look towards going forward.
Yeah, I think one counterpoint I might make is I aspire to be more healthful in my food choices, but I find that that doesn't always win out. And I think that there are many other people who might choose the tastier option over healthier options, even though that might not be what's best for them. So that's kind of like a difficult preference to deal with. And I don't know if other people had different experiences, but I think I do feel like Mastodon is like a really great example, and sort of interesting because I feel like it hasn't taken off, but I really welcome any challenges. And I think that another thing that I just want to highlight is the hyper-capitalistic, platforms. That's not great. But one problem is that moderating these platforms and the teams of lawyers that they need to have, and like running all those moderation things costs a lot of money. Like, it is not cheap to, as we might see with Twitter becoming increasingly like hands off the steering wheel and stuff, can be less expensive to just sort of let things go. And I guess like it just takes many resources to police a platform properly that I feel like then you would need to introduce alternatives, like perhaps government funding or some other way to provide those resources for like smaller platforms. Otherwise, they might be, they might need money and they just can't compete.
I think following up maybe on a good for you theme, Daphne asked yesterday about essentially a question about system 1 and system 2 engagement, right? So system 1, the quick, reflexive, not very deliberative approach to making decisions, and system 2 where we engage, deliberate, perhaps stop and think. We essentially have system 1 systems out there, right? And I think you're making the argument that in some cases we need or could move to system 2 systems. Is that something is that the argument that you're making, and is that possible?
Yeah, I guess kind of. So one thing that I think relates to this is, just these discussions about the perils of just optimizing for engagement and how that extends our time on these platforms, and how that's harmful in many ways. And I think regarding time spent on these platforms, there's a couple ways to think about it. One is that the time spent is unproductive, and then the other is that the time spent is actually productive. And I think that can tie into system 1, system 2 a little bit, in that a lot of the time, I think most of the discourse around social media usage time has been focused more on kind of the more unproductive pieces of it, in that you're kind of just shutting off your mind and consuming, and then when you leave the platform, you don't really take away anything that will help you in your life outside of the platform. But if these affordances can prompt, I guess, like more system 2 levels of thinking, and can start to turn these platforms into, say, like, tools for learning, and tools for appreciating other people's talents, etc. I think that can really change the way time is spent on these platforms, and perhaps transition things into kind of like being more productive and being more meaningful. And that way, like, time on these platforms will actually be, something, can potentially be something positive instead of just being in a negative light all the time.
I have a quick comment and question. Mostly thinking about sort of temporalities of implementation of these sort of phasing changes that could occur on platforms, and sort of considering also specifically like when we take sort of maybe more, so if we take a step back from maybe platforms and we think about other forms of infrastructure implementation, like if you think of like biking in the Netherlands or something, it took 30 years for that to become sort of the norm in the country for travel as a beneficial way of getting around, but also because initially it was about reducing traffic accidents with children. And so this question of like, how do we identify risk and then think about sort of slowly using public and private incentivizing to then get to a point where maybe the beneficial side effect is that now it's sort of accepted as a wide, like a modality that everybody uses, but in fact that was not necessarily the case when it started. And so my question to you, and I think a question that's sort of come up throughout the different panels of the conference, is thinking about like what are the phasings of implementation? Like what are temporalities that we could think of for these design changes that also could, allow folks to think about adapting to a new norm of use on platforms, because we know that there are risks. And I think there's been plenty of evidence now that is stating that those risks can be shown, and we're seeing these sort of siloed effects and all these other things. So like, what is the phasing that we could be imagining, and how can we be encouraging that across platforms, I think, on this systems 2 shift that you're also noting?
Jason.
Take it away. I mean, I think this is verging out of my realm of knowledge here. I think this is where regulation has to come in, right? And I am extremely nervous to talk about regulation at a Knight Foundation event as someone who's never studied law. So I'm going to stop there.
I guess like maybe this is an answer that, threads onto the example of biking the Netherlands, because I was actually listening to a podcast recently about this, so this is kind of fresh in my head. But one of the main reasons for success of widespread adoption of bicycles as a method of transportation in the Netherlands is these very passionate groups of like anti-car groups and like pro-biking groups that basically came together and said, we're going to do this, we're going to change the way things are. So one potential direction forward might be to empower user groups and regulatory groups and different groups of stakeholders to come together and have more of these kinds of conversations, and to kind of think about and test out and evaluate and ideate on these new kinds of design affordances and design principles.
So we have time for 2 quick last questions. Let me ask one quick answers so we can squeeze another. Are we worried about all people or some groups of people? There's a question online. It's if we see different behaviors from different age cohorts, are you more optimistic about maybe the younger crowds?
I think kind of just to hammer home the earlier point I made, I think I think I would be most concerned about people with worse digital literacy. Mm-hmm. So maybe an older generation or people who can't really distinguish, misleading TikToks or misinformation from factual, reliable news.
Yeah, focusing on misinformation, I mean, there is evidence that older adults are more susceptible to it. But I also think there's evidence from David Rand's group showing that elite members of society are really driving a lot of the spread of misinformation on platforms. So I think there's more than just an age breakdown or sort of demographic breakdowns that we can look at. There's political incentives for groups to engage with these systems differently, and it would be nice to try to examine those.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think we would be in deep trouble if kind of all users were the problem, and it would be great to focus on kind of these specific avenues with which we can improve these systems.
Sorry, not much to add. Just on the production side, right? Mm-hmm. Of misinformation and stuff like this, it's been found that it's super spreaders, right? A bit like with COVID, and so I think efforts to slow production should target those super spreaders rather than something that hurts everyone.
And final one, maybe short questions, short answers.
Virginia Dignam, I just have to react on the bikes in the Netherlands. I'm Dutch. And there are no anti-car groups in the Netherlands or whatever other kind of things like that. The
really?
success of the bicycles in the Netherlands, and I think we can learn from that. One is education and culture. We have been biking in the Netherlands since the 20s, and that's the kind of thing to go. And another one, as important, is the existence of infrastructure, which makes it possible to bike safely around. And that, I think, it goes very much in line with what you are saying about the alternatives and fair trade and things like that. Infrastructure makes it possible, and because the infrastructure is there, then we all bike. But there are no cars, anti-car groups or whatever, things like that, that make it possible, or strong opinions on bikes in the Netherlands.
Okay.
Thank you.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, I'll revisit the podcast and see. But yeah, thank you for the point about infrastructure. I think that's definitely very relevant. Yeah.
All right, let's thank our panel. I think we're taking a break and
Thank you all very much. We're just going to take a 10-minute break, and then we're going to be right back here for the last panel.
chapters are on there too, right?
Yeah.
Everyone.
The what?
The descriptions of everyone are on there in the doc.
Oh, wait, hold on. I think I have a list for you.
Oh yeah. Thank you. This is exactly what I was looking for. This is perfect. Oh, great. Okay, great.
Everyone, we're going to get started in just a moment. Please take your seats. Please take your seats. We're going to get started in just a moment. Please take your seats, everyone. We're going to start in just a moment. Please take your seats. We're going to get started. Thank you.
Yeah, it really is.
All right, hi everyone. I'm Katie Glenn Bass. I'm the research director at the Knight Institute. We are at our last panel of this symposium, which has been wonderful. Thank you all again for coming out here in the midst of the hurricane-like conditions outside. We have Joe Bach-Coleman moderating this panel. He is an associate research scholar at the Craig Newmark Center for Journalism, Ethics, and Security at Columbia University, and he is a computational social scientist. After this panel is over, we are serving lunch. You're welcome to stay and chat informally with everyone else who is here. Thank you again for coming. Please take it away.
I'm having flashbacks to giving a best man speech before dinner. So bear with me. I think it's been a really great workshop because I've learned a lot. At the same time, I feel further away from like answering the question, which is, I think, a sign of progress. I think behind that is there's been this theme that's emerged that there's very little consensus on the scale of complexity that we are interested in optimizing for. Do we want individuals to have a good time online in the moment, or do we want to have groups, have community, or make sure democracy is stable or global peace? And the lever we have to adjust that is really at the level of the individual. We control what they see, how they see it, who they interact with. So we're thinking about cross-scale dynamics, but really interacting with individuals and content. We have to apply those levers in bulk. So they just personalized in the sense that each person sees different things, but algorithmically it's kind of applied en masse. And I think it's hard to know really how those changes will lead to larger scale changes of things we care about and how that'll feed back down to the individual. And that seems to be sort of like one of the key things in the trade-offs we're talking about here with misinformation and free speech and sort of engagement. And like Joel was mentioning, like all these things are great, but the user has to want to do it and actually enjoy the experience. So these trade-offs, I think, are really kind of core to why I feel more confused now than I did yesterday. And interestingly, our norms and values seem to have come about in a world where there's a physical structure that creates communities and it bridges us and it creates divisions. And so it like offloads a lot of this decision making for us into like physical space and time. So it feels a bit like we built a lever and pulled it and then realized like it's a trolley car problem. We have to figure out where the train's going, who it's going to hit, who it's going to miss. And so like the question that I'm at now is optimizing for what scale of complexity, on what time scale and what contexts, and how do we manage trade-offs, and how do we technically manage any of that? And these talks actually, I think, get at that question in a lot of different ways. So I'll stop talking and pass this over to Georgina Bourne, who's a professor of anthropology and music at the Department of Anthropology, University College London. She previously taught at Oxford and Cambridge. And earlier, she had a professional life as a musician in experimental rock, jazz, and improvised music, which is well worth a Google and a listen, I can assure you. Whatever you want to do.
So thanks very much, Joe. Can you hear me okay? Good, okay. And warm thanks for the whole event to Katie and Arvind and the rest of the team at the Knight Institute. So this is the final panel, and we return to normative questions. We heard about this yesterday, and today my collaborator Fernando Diaz and I are introducing a new perspective concerned with the well-being of our collective public life. Our focus is on music recommendation systems, and music here becomes a lens through which to address the algorithmic curation of cultural and entertainment content by streaming platforms writ large. Current debates tend to neglect the cumulative influence of recommender systems on the evolution of cultural experience and taste across populations and over time, shaping the cultures and societies in which they're used. Now, we want to dwell on this power, asking, if we acknowledge this cumulative influence of recommendation, to which societal and cultural ends should this influence be directed? Music recommender systems, as most of you know, base their curatorial decisions on algorithms optimized for objectives like engagement, retention, and ad revenue. Even in cases where the language of diversity is used, it's done selectively and to the end of profit. Multiple studies demonstrate the problematic effects of this kind of optimization. Some genres and content creators are amplified, while many other musicians and musical cultures are never represented. Now, if existing studies describe these kind of distortions, they don't tell us what a more just curation might look like. Could new forms of algorithmic curation be developed to promote cultural experiences oriented to social justice and the public good? For guidance on normative values that have been productive for public culture, we turn to principles guiding public service media systems. We call them PSM. So public service media like the BBC, the Canadian and Australian broadcasting corporations is a worldwide phenomenon. The BBC is often the model, and it's exerted a lot of influence historically on public interest models of media organization in Europe and the Commonwealth. We take our lead from the normative principles underlying the BBC. I myself did 15 years of work, and I've published widely on the BBC and PSM. The recent Twitter storm over the BBC's designation as government-funded media repeats a common misunderstanding. The BBC is not a state broadcaster. It's publicly funded by a dedicated tax, and it's independent of government, albeit imperfectly, as those following the news yesterday and today will realize. The institutions of PSM have been a central plank of many democratic cultures. These principles, refined over decades in the production and distribution of numerous genres of cultural and entertainment content, can expand the desiderata of recommender systems to include values that enhance the cultural and social development of contemporary societies. Now, while our work is inspired by and relevant to PSM organizations designing recommender systems, we believe it's also relevant to commercial music recommender systems interested in fostering similar goals. And I think the last panel kind of ended edging towards this idea of a public infrastructure. Now, the PSM principles are big ideas. They include citizenship, universality, independence, quality, innovation, diversity, accountability, and participation. Of course, they need interpreting and elaborating, and then translating into the design of new systems, and this is the work we've begun. Our current work expands on our previously published work in 5 ways. I'm going to go very briefly through. To do this, like Christian and Tomo, who presented yesterday, we want to reconceptualize recommender systems as larger socio-technical systems, making it possible to expand the scope of the translation of normative values into design of these larger systems. So we begin with critiques informed by the normative values I've mentioned. Our first target is personalization, a core property of recommender systems. Now, the personalization paradigm, as you all know, is ubiquitous. It conceives of the effects of recommendation as a kind of aggregate individuation. But this is inadequate both empirically and normatively. Personalization encourages fragmentation and atomization based on the recursive individuation of users. This is destructive of the cultural fabric underpinning our deepest social identifications. In contrast, the PSM principles of citizenship and universality begin from the recognition of human life as embedded in social and cultural communities, addressing consumers not just as individuals, but as publics composed of citizen consumers. We draw, in the longer paper, on political philosophy to propose that it's this mode of address that should be taken to recommender systems. But we go further, employing the idea of cultural citizenship, which responds to the vast social transformations posed by globalization, migration, and the intensification of identity politics among subaltern groups. In the context of multicultural societies, cultural citizenship draws attention to the urgency of demands for cultural rights, including the right to symbolic presence, to dignifying representation, and the maintenance of distinct cultural identities. The implication is the need for cultural curation at scale by recommender systems to focus both on commonality and on plurality, on the provision of unifying, but also intercultural and at times intracultural forms of cultural experience. Our second critique concerns the model of the user immanent in recommender systems. Now, this model assumes that individual consumers come with fully formed tastes and desires and merely seek something similar in the next track they listen to. Recommendation is modeled in the terms of serial, individual, one-off choices guided by ideas of similarity between tracks, users, and contexts, and by data, of course, on past behavior. Music recommenders therefore occlude questions of aesthetic experience in both their model of the user's relationship to music and the editorial processes that guide curation. Any more temporally extended concern with the dynamic development of taste or with how taste should evolve over time, either over an individual life course or collectively in the sense of progressive cultural change, are evacuated, or, as in current language models, they reproduce and reinforce dominant trajectories found in usage data. The prevailing model of the user is then impoverished, and it lacks awareness of the normative curatorial responsibility to enable the progressive development of users' aesthetic experience. Note that this is not an elitist point. It holds for the appreciation of popular music as much as art music. And here we're drawing on work from cultural studies showing that the progressive development of aesthetic experience both occurs and matters deeply in relation to popular culture and entertainment. Content must be curated so that it doesn't just meet past tastes, but moves the listener along, introducing difference, exceeding her expectations, generating new experiences and new expectations. A third proposal follows on. We contend that human editors are vital to the cultural curation we're proposing based on normative principles. But we move beyond the individual gatekeeper model, that idea of the individual expert. Citing the normative value of participation, we argue that today aesthetic judgment is both individual and social, shared among all those participating in what we call a value community, and the object of collective reflection over the quality of artists, genres, or individual tracks. In this light, the role of editors is to reflect on the quality, innovation, or diversity of recommendation by drawing on insights and judgments generated by the larger value community, knowledgeable about the music being recommended, and then to intervene editorially so as to amplify these desired qualities. Cultivating values of quality, innovation, and diversity in what is recommended requires human editors because algorithms alone will never draw curation closer to such value communities, given the limitations of how good is quantified in existing recommender systems. akin to participatory design, the editors act then as conduits for larger communities of taste and interest, and their judgments will, of course, be validated by and accountable to those communities. So our final two proposals zoom out further in the socio-technical system and both address the oligopolistic industry structure of recommendation, the extreme concentration exhibited by the global platforms as they function worldwide through licensing and acquisition deals with the major record companies, in this way constraining the space of possible tracks that can be recommended and dictating the cost associated with those tracks. In short, radically restricting the diversity of both source and content in the music recommended. Our first proposal is about the catalogue of music on which recommenders draw. It is very simply that alternative public interest catalogues should be developed through partnerships to counteract this structure. The BBC, interestingly, provides a precursor. It's called the Creative Archive, and it was their attempt in the mid-2000s to create partnerships with other major public cultural institutions in Britain to generate a vast publicly funded audiovisual and music archive available for free download for consumption and non-profit creative reuse. Our second proposal comes to regulation in a different way, and mentioned at the end of that panel, and it's again about creating conditions conducive to diversity of source and content. And it's the need to regulate for simply a less concentrated, more pluralistic industry to allow medium-sized and small independent companies access to the recommender economy. Now, it's a feature of the history of the old music industry that a rise in innovative, diverse output was correlated with periods in which the industry was less concentrated. So to end, culture is always curated. Great phrase from my colleague Tarleton Gillespie, who gave this phrase yesterday. And currently, recommended design denies its role in the mass curation of cultural experience. We contend that this denial has to end. Let's talk about the curation of culture to enhance the making of cultural publics and for the public good. Thank you.
So our next speaker, his bio is a little bit out of date, but as of sometime recently, he is or was affiliated with Harvard Berkman Klein Center. He is or was a visiting researcher at Cambridge University Center for the Future of Intelligence. He did or does consult for technology companies, civil society organizations, and funders, and he researched or researches and supported or supports approaches for technology governance, building on insights from offline deliberative democracy and AI-augmented deliberation technology. So whenever you're ready, and if there's a timer if you need it.
Yes, that would be great. Thank you for that most excellent introduction. So I'm Aviva Vaidya. I work at the intersection of AI, platforms, information, and governance. I'm going to give a quick overview behind bridging systems that were alluded to last panel, some of the real-world use of it by platforms, and how this relates to other important threads. And most of this work was done in collaboration with Luke Thorburn and bridging systems in particular. That paper was all in collaboration. He's in the audience here also. So in some ways, when we talk about bridging systems, we're really just talking about correcting a massive oversight. If we define a bridging system as something that increases mutual understanding and trust across divides, there are two separate things I need to move here. Most of the other sort of definitions have been brought up today. It's something that was embedded across society. We've had cultures, traditions, institutions, nonverbal cues, family structures, all of which ensure that we had some level of bridging that's necessary for a society's level of trust. Our economic systems even depend on that level of bridging. And so the idea that we now need algorithms that are meeting our communication, and that they're not actively, they're only optimizing for engagement as sort of the core is sort of weird. And so bridging-based ranking, the idea here is that we want to have rank systems that are explicitly trying to increase mutual understanding across divides. Oops, sorry. This is the challenge here. So what does it look like in practice? Here's an example to one approach to bridging, diverse approval. With engagement-based ranking, the posts that get the most divisive reactions, they're often ranked the highest. And here you can see sort of red hates something, blue loves it. With diverse approval, the posts that are liked the most across divides are ranked highest instead, and the most divisive posts are ranked lowest. And before I go any farther, I want to clarify common misunderstandings. When I'm talking about something like bridging, I'm not talking about eliminating conflict or promoting a particular viewpoint. It's just promoting more productive forms of conflict. And it's not always directly practical with simpler approaches like diverse approval, but this is what we're ultimately aiming to measure. And bridging is not just about showing people content from the other side. That can make things worse. And the goal is not just to rank content higher if it's approved by the majority. And so for more detail on the rationale behind all this, there's a report published with Harvard's Belfer Center that focuses on that. And it's really focusing on sort of the policy as like bridging as this missing ingredient, this thing that we're not optimizing for enough. But parallel to that, and sort of following the success of that, Luke and I spent a year sort of diving into the technical and social challenges and open problems around bridging in practice in our ranking and recommender systems. So that paper is sort of the core focus here. And you can see the preprint for that now already. It's linked to from bridging.systems. And it's all deeply informed by the work of many people, including Amanda Ripley, Jonathan Strayu's here, Chris Bale. And the goal is to reconceptualize again, like so many of us before, what online platforms are and how they connect to our ideas of offline environments. We formalize attention allocation as this thing that's core to communication processes that can bridge divides, and then we use that to look at open problems that help accelerate the development of things like bridging-based ranking systems that optimize for this different optimization target. And metrics are the core to this. You cannot improve something that you cannot measure, and you won't know if they're even sort of improvements are working. So I'm not going to get into the technical details here, but this sort of shows, this diagram shows the sort of leverage points of bridging across different kinds of systems, whether it be a Facebook group, a YouTube recommendation algorithm, a poll list discussion that was mentioned, or even a facilitated conflict mediation. These things are always happening implicitly in the facilitators. So we're going to call out a set of rich open problems across many disciplines and practice areas. So like, for example, how do systems that represent information about people and their relationships to each other, like how are they representing that? What kinds of metrics are appropriate to capture that intuition of bridging, including across different contexts and actually make them practical to use? What are the heuristics that are helpful, and how do we help evaluate them? And how do we address robustness to attackers' ethical challenges, economic incentives? There's a lot of open questions, right? But the status quo right now is, like as we've discussed, in some ways, it's so bad that we want to encourage not just academic, but active experimentation. And there has been some by platforms. It seems like it's hubris for us to think that we can move our society from to algorithmically mediated communication without building bridging into the core of that. And so most of the impacts of this work are sort of private in the way that platforms are doing things, but there is a notable exception where Twitter has been actively investing in bridging in an explicit, though narrow way. And it does seem to help. It survived the Elon Musk transition. There are challenges with community notes, which are using a bridging-based ranking system, but it is better than not having it. And I think that's going to be true in many of these environments. And there might be some critique on that we'll hear. But more generally, the point of bridging-based ranking, bridging systems, is to sort of provide ammo, in a sense, for employees to say explicitly, here is a very concrete, different thing that we can add or optimize for. And they can point to Twitter as an apparent success of that, where it really has had some very concrete positive impacts that you can point to particular tweets. But I want to address another really important challenge to bridging, and this is sort of what led to me completely rechanging this deck to fit this in the last like day or so, because this keep coming up, and this is another line of work that I think is going to be really relevant to this audience. And this is this question of who decides, right? How do we decide what we're even optimizing for? Like, isn't engagement just based ranking, just giving people what they want? Isn't that what they've said they wanted? And so this led to this parallel work stream for about 3 years, which is how do we best understand that? And not only that, who should be deciding how much bridging or engagement is the right thing to do? Like, is it social media companies or governments or whatever? And this is from a survey from the Knight Foundation, not the Knight First Amendment Institute, to clarify. And this, yeah, and so I wanted to understand sort of what are the ways to answer those questions with democratic legitimacy that are actually applicable to transnational platforms where you have multiple governments that, and there might be a single system that is being governed. And my conclusion is that we can actually build on decades of experience in applied deliberative democracy and deliberative tools to provide richer, deeper, better informed answers around what systems should optimize for in a way that actually protects against the excesses of both companies and governments. And it's great when democratic governments can effectively legislate on platforms without partisan pressure, but that alone does not sufficiently regulate either transnational impacts or platform-specific decisions. And there are ways to address that. And in particular, citizen assembly, sortition, collective response systems, they provide some of these keys. And this isn't just idealism. There are unexpectedly aligned incentives here that make it practically possible for platforms themselves to have independent third parties run democratic processes, even where in places where government regulation might be stalled. And I have permission to actually share a little bit about something that's both exciting and depressing relating to this conference on this, which is that last year, I had set up Twitter to actually work with such a third party to run a pilot of a process like this, to answer questions around what they should be amplifying, and how do they balance free expression and their other responsibilities. And this was going to be kicked off when the acquisition stalled everything, and everyone on the relevant teams was fired, and so yeah, so it's exciting and depressing. But other powerful technology companies are exploring these approaches, and there are actually benefits to delegating to some third-party process that they have little to no control over, but which allows them to determine the answers to these thorny questions. To protect against the excesses of both the companies and the authoritarian and potentially very partisan and self-serving governments. No, sorry. Sorry, this is the multi-slide problem. Okay, so what does it actually mean in practice? You bring together this representative microcosm of an impacted population, have them deliberate on what should be done with access and input to experts and stakeholders, and there's a democratic foundation here that rests on this idea of a democratic lottery where every person has an equal chance of being selected. This is an overly positive and solutionist way to describe this because I have very limited time. I'd love to get into the weeds of sort of how this affects all the different trade-offs that sort of come into doing something like this. But to make it really visceral, this is an in-person version of such a process convened by the EU. These are not elected representatives in the European hemicycle, but people selected by democratic lottery, essentially at random from across all of the EU countries, deliberating across all of the EU official languages, helping determine its future. And so going back to bridging, ultimately, I think the population's being impacted by powerful platforms and these AI systems, and other kinds of AI systems like the generative ones, those populations should be the ones who are ultimately deciding. And my intuition is, should be deciding sort of what those systems are optimized for, what they're aiming to reward. And my intuition is that people will actually want more bridging than we currently have in these systems. And we hope that the Bridging Systems paper helps at least provide a concrete thing that you can put on the map for people to decide between. Thank you. And thank you all for hosting.
All right, we have one more speaker for the workshop. Alessandro Piscopo is a lead data scientist at the BBC's product group. His team, Data Lab, develops recommendation engines across the organization and has deployed live recommenders on products such as BBC Sounds, BBC World Service, and the BBC News app, something probably most of us have used. His research interests lie at the intersection of peer production communities, collaborative knowledge engineering, data quality, and responsible AI. The timer, it's just up there.
Okay, thank you. I'm aware I'm I'm standing between you and your lunch. So, but I think this is very complementary to the presentations we've just heard. Let's start with something. What are recommenders? I understand this is a room where mostly everyone knows what a recommender is, what the recommender system is. But I think it's good to point out, just to give a definition as a starting point. And I think recommenders are a way to sift through large catalogs and surface relevant and tailored content to users. Well, everybody, just if you think about Netflix, Spotify, just you have in mind just what it means in practice for you. The thing is, just given the definition I've just given, this is something we, as an organization, have always done, deciding what's going on the homepage of BBC News, deciding which content gets promoted and which doesn't. However, we decided as an organization that it was about time. This has been just done manually so far, but we thought that we wanted to give our audiences a personalized experience, and because we wanted to provide value for money, we have lots of content, but also we have lots of users. So how to just make sure these users make the most over time, and we wanted to just give users a personalized experience because they expect it. They think it's valuable to have personal experience. So in this way, just you can understand recommendations are, after all, editorial curation at scale. Now, the thing is, very often recommender systems, we've heard it just throughout these 2 days, are optimized for engagement. But that's where things get a bit more difficult, especially for a public service organization as the BBC. So what does being a public service organization mean? Well, we've just heard it from Georgina. I will use perhaps more institutional words to that, but I think they very much reconnect to what she said. We are a public service organization because our mission and values and public purposes are defined by our charter, and our mission is to act in the public interest, serving all audiences through the provision of impartial, high quality and distinctive output and services, which inform, educate, and entertain. I won't go in detail through all public purposes, but just to mention some, like we want to provide impartial news and information to help people understand the world around them. We want to support learning. We want to show the most creative and highest quality content. And we want to reflect and represent the diverse communities of the United Kingdom. So impartiality, universality, diversity, learning, creativity. Now, let's reconnect with what we were saying. Just recommendations are very often optimized for engagement. The problem is just the metrics used for engagement. And engagement itself is a very rough approximation of our definition of values and for our public purposes. So from that, the first challenge derives, which is how should goals and values be encoded into the BBC's recommendation algorithm? But we take this as a socio-technical challenge, not only a technical one. And from that, it derives our second challenge, which is how should different points of view, and those in particular, those represented by editorial, data science, and product, be brought together to ensure relevant domain knowledge is represented in our recommender systems. And I'm going to tell you about how we try to address these challenges by voicing these three sides of the equation: data science, product, and editorial. As a BBC person, I should have some props, possibly a wig or something to pretend I'm. But unfortunately, I don't have them, so I will start just by telling, starting from my perspective, which is a data scientist. As data scientists, our role is to translate our product and editorial requirements into actual recommenders. So over the whole process of the development of recommenders, we go from the product problem definition to exploration to refining our models. We take into account editorial and product feedback, and we try to translate it into technical approaches, which might even require developing tools like what we've done in the past to optimize, to gather editorial feedback, and then tweak our algorithms accordingly. And of course, and the editorial involvement, the conversation we have with the other sides depends on where we are in the process. I'll quickly move to the other voices in these in this circle, in these three sides of the equation, because I know the clock is ticking now. But looking at the product side, say product managers have the role to lead on defining the strategy and objectives, identifying new product opportunities, and ensure teams have the context needed to build successful product. They looked at the aspects of feasibility, usability, viability, and value. And they look also at something that's, I just say we don't really want to have, but it's an engagement, because engagement is not our main value, but it's important. We look at engagement because we want to be sure that people actually click and use our content and consume our content. And I'll move to editorial. And well, editors are those who provide the domain knowledge which drives the data scientist's work with regard to recommendations quality, their adherence to editorial guidelines. They look at 4 different aspects. They look at compliance. They are those who help us keep content safe from legal, editorial, and reputational risk. They know the content catalog very well. So they are those who point us to outliers, who point us to patterns, who say, oh, these 2 pieces of content, they don't fit well together. This is sensitive content. You don't want users to see these 2 articles next to each other. And by doing so, they help us ensure the content that is surfaced is as accurate, impartial, and relevant as it can be, and that it does not cause harm or offense, and particularly when dealing with difficult content. And they even help us just when we find something we cannot solve with the metadata and data we've got, they help us with additional metadata. We can just feedback and say, oh, we really need some, I don't know, tone tagging for articles so that it's easier for us to actually get what we want to achieve. And so just to finish my presentation, we have some open questions. But first, I want to start from just by the question of these events, which is optimizing for what? I can say we optimize for editorial judgment. And, but as I've just said, this is not easy. And this happens through a collaborative approach, which leverages a diversity of viewpoints so that we bring together people with different skills and task-relevant knowledge and try to ensure that all of those are reflected. But, and this is important also because we need to take a holistic point of view, which is recommendations. Our recommendations don't live in isolation. On a page, you find recommended content, non-recommended content, and different, the different parts of a page have to just live in the same space. And then this collaboration, that's a tightrope to walk. There's an inherent tension between these 3 functions. And when they are balanced, when they work together, it's great. It's a great process. And we are also happy just to work together. But also sometimes, when they are balanced, that trade-off and compromises that we make just can distort outcome, and they can bias solutions toward narrower notions of success. So I'll finish with 4 points that we still haven't solved until now. The first is scale. These approaches worked until now, and but it might be hard to scale it, especially as the number of recommenders across the organization increases. We don't have many more. The BBC has lots of different services and products, and we cannot scale the same way. The number of editors who help us. The second thing is success. I think we just heard that you cannot improve something you cannot measure. We measure success to a certain point, but then when our recommenders go live, our only measure of success is click-through rate, and we are aware that this is a problem we have to address. But in large organizations, there are lots of constraints, and things are possibly take some time to move. Under the organizational point of view, we had to find, and we still need to improve our common language across data, editorial, and product. Data literacy is key in that process, and we've started organizing courses and training for that, but there's a long way to go. And I just finished because time is up. And just values. We were talking about amplification and what is wrongful, what its aims should be, and especially under a social media perspective. I think it's good to finish this session talking about public service media, because we are in the we are privileged to have already a set of values we can refer to, and it's like as if we've done the first step. We know what our values are. Now it's about how we put it in practice and how we ensure they are reflected in our recommendations. Thank you very much, everyone.
All right, so that was, I think, a fascinating series of talks, and it was great hearing it kind of thoroughly and together, because I think there's a nice link here between thinking about the things we care about on a normative level, the practical implementation and the challenges of measuring things and bringing people together, like Aviv talked about, then the human process of creating a dynamic and a workflow that can bridge these two things. So I really think this is excellent final reform section. When I read your papers initially, I read them like before the workshop started, and I read all these questions, and they're all totally changed now because the workshop, then I wound up rereading your papers today, stuck on the train, and thinking about them different. And so I would love to hear from each of you, what about your own papers do you view or feel differently about after everything else you've seen here? And maybe we'll start with, we'll just go in the order of the talks, if that works.
Okay. Hi, can you hear me all right? Yeah. Feeling differently about the paper. I think what I've been scribbling is the incredibly interesting resonances across a number of the papers that we workshop, on Thursday, and then we've been presenting publicly. And I'd just like to pick up a couple. I mean, there are the obvious resonances with Alessandro's view from inside the BBC and the struggles involved in the kind of complex cultural connections across data science, editorial, and product development. But I think more interesting to me are two things. One, what are the resonances with Ben and Helen's paper about the problem of good epistemic processes? Because they were posing, in a very different direction, knowledge, news information, very profound questions, and I love that resonance with our work. The other thing I just pick up, interestingly, from listening now to Aviv, your excursion into deliberative democracy, into citizen assemblies, participatory methods, representation, deliberation. I was very much taken back to Seth's paper, Seth Lazar's paper, and his idea of communicative justice. I think there are many resonances actually also with my paper, but in particular Seth's insistence on this wonderful idea of moral equality. Anyway, just some thoughts.
Aviv, do you want to?
Yeah, I guess one thing I would say is that it's when you write a sort of a paper that's like, oh, we're trying to accelerate sort of investment in a set of areas. This is going back to the bridging piece, and then seeing like in the 2 years and almost since we started that, having there be so much more like people building and sort of doing more of that work. It's just been incredibly exciting to see all the different connections and all the momentum toward bridging work that is not just inside platforms, little bits and pieces, but in public in so many of the papers here. And also it's been really interesting to see the practical, like the sort of nitty-gritty practical details. Like I really appreciate your paper in particular, because it goes into here the sort of three sort of stakeholders within this organization that need to be navigated in order to achieve that goal. This is something I've seen a lot in practice, but I don't have the ability to make that explicit for the organizations that I'm talking to. And like the different stakeholders that are all sort of needing to both collaborate or maybe even might be in conflict in actually getting these things to happen within those organizations, even though there might be at the very top some set of incentives. Like maybe, there's an argument to be made that if you implement bridging at varying levels, it actually decreases content moderation costs in a significant way, right? And there's some evidence to suggest that might be the case. It's not really public, but now it's in Facebook papers that have been released. I mean, they don't explicitly make that point, but they do sort of point out the decrease in things that were sort of like removed after the fact. And so at the very top, maybe like, you know, Mark Zuckerberg or whoever might like get more profit in a sense because they're doing bridging, because there's less cost on content moderation. But the actual sort of org structure might make that difficult because you have someone who's on newsfeed who's trying to increase engagement, and you have someone on content moderation who's trying to decrease costs, but maybe there isn't really alignment in terms of their individual incentives as people within an organization. And so I see there being almost still some scholarship that's missing that I'm excited to see around, and some more practical work around how do you actually do this within an organization effectively to sort of square that circle.
Thanks. Well, just on my side, I think there are lots of things that I don't know if they would lead me to just make things or write things differently in my paper, but definitely some aspects I started thinking of. Well, there is the aspect of you know, metrics and the technical approaches. You know, just hearing about this bridging approach is brilliant. We are already aware that metrics already exist that could be used to optimize our recommenders for. But seeing like this aspect in practice and seeing like just empirical evidence that this could be a solution, I think it was very good. Another thing which we haven't considered, but mostly because of lack of time and space, it's we describe these this kind of triangle of data, editorial, and product. And of course, it's much broader than that. It's just that this happens within an organization. So it's influenced by lots of other functions. It's influenced by all the complexities within a large organization. You maybe do you going in a direction and thinking you're doing well, and then just you hear that somewhere in another part of the organization, something is happening that one day will lead to your work just being worthless but you don't know. It's like this, you know, you hear, you hear that like your like ear is just perceiving something, but just jokes aside, there was, so there's these, and just going even broader, we haven't really considered, you know, the effect of the audiences, because this triangle, and there's the organization, and then there's the, you know, largest societal, you know, setting in which we are based, and just how does our project process change, our development process change when we take audiences into account? How should we should we think about a participative approach? Should we find a way to, you know, hear what audiences think about our recommendation? I really would like to, but of course, again, that comes with some complexities. And the very last thing, and was something that Georgina just mentioned in her presentation. She mentioned that personalization is empirically and normatively inadequate, which is something we haven't really questioned, because there is this assumption that, well, people expect personalization. Personalization is cool. I mean, I think just going, that could be a rabbit hole that, I mean, it's my job. If I just find out that personalization is not good, I would be just, I would lose my job, because basically developing recommenders see what I do. But it's an interesting point. You know, sometimes we take it for granted that, wow, we should offer personalization because that's what everyone does. Well, possibly not necessarily, because as an organization, our values are different. I won't go into that because that would, there's this thin line between my personal opinion and the organization opinion. And
yeah, so that's, I think this idea of personalization versus scale was like rich throughout all of your talks. And especially thinking about musical context, we have these sort of local musical movements that form that you were part of at one point in time. But we also have like the hit of the summer that comes from the top down. And so, you know, I would love to hear a little bit from each of you while folks are submitting questions online. How do we think about those trade-offs across the scale? Like if we have more of the hit songs, we lose the the local countercultures or subcultures, or for Aviv's case, if we're trying to bridge at some sort of larger national level, are we losing local politics in this space? And then for the BBC, how do you handle these sort of trade-offs between scales of work? Like, this is an area that I think is really interesting.
Thanks. I mean, I'll take that first. I've written a whole paper on this. I'll send you it, Joe.
Oh, great. Yeah.
So again, I mean, what it's not a zero-sum game, right? You know, we need channels that do enable kind of, you know, large-scale communication across very large groups. You know, the great British public, the great American public, and we do have them, and we need those things to continue. But we also, of course, need to pluralize, and we need smaller sort of spaces of exchange. We need the indie music, but we also need for communities to be able to speak to themselves and for communities to speak to each other and to the nation, right? So we need a really interesting, rich kind of architecture here. And that, so nobody's against the big hits, me least. But to have only that, or to have that always rising to the top, seems to be, at the moment, the problem.
Any other thoughts from down the table?
So I think just under the perspective, just from the BBC perspective, there are two different things that should be distinguished. First of all, well, as an organization, we do more than, like, we are producer of content and we distribute our content. And I think without mentoring recommender system, BBC already has like a local news and tries to balance just with, and using like manual curation and editorial curation tries to balance this aspect of local and UK-wide content, possibly more niche content, and let's say more, how would you say, in a way that is not demeaning them, just it's more popular content in a sense. Hits, I don't know, think about BBC series. There are, I think, for all tastes, and I think in the side of entertainment, there is a lot. When it comes to recommendations, unfortunately, I don't have a good answer to that, because very often our answer has been dealing with editorial and product and just talking about, what recommendations should go on that page. And the solution has been, well, either having some parts focusing on recommendations, some parts being customized, as in just showing your local news, other parts using approaches that were kind of hybrids, personalized and editorial approaches, for instance, ranking some list of editorially selected content. But it's still something, just we are still creating our own approach. So I'd be happy to tell you more next year, I hope.
Yeah, absolutely. Exciting. Do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth remembering that with things like bridging, the goal is very much not homogenization, and that's not even achievable in any sense. If you think about any sort of great conflicts in history between countries or even between people, no amount of bridging systems or like ranking systems is going to make like Hamilton and Burr not angry, whatever. Like there's just no. Like France and Germany back whenever and nowadays you talk about, let's say, Israel, Palestine, no amount is going to change who those people are. It's a question of, can people see that there are things that they all agree on? Can you create a space where the conversation is not just kinetic conflict, but where the conversation is, we're going to actually try to understand each other a little bit. We're gonna see that you are people too, and that's in a sense what you're aiming for, and it's really all you can achieve, because we all have incredible amounts of inertia in terms of who we are, and that's a very, very strong countervailing force, and no amount of ranking system or even generative systems are going to be able to fully overcome.
So I think we're going to move to questions from the audience folks here, and if we have about 15 minutes before lunch, so we've got plenty of time, I think. Go ahead.
Cool. Thanks for the panel. So my question starts with Alejandro's talk as context, but I think that it touches on things that all the panelists have talked about. So I'm particularly interested in this relationship between the data scientists and the editorial staff, because I think that kind of relationship is pretty unique and not one that's explored or doesn't come up as often. It's similar to other things that do, but I think distinctly different. So for example, it's similar to the connection between data scientists and product teams that usually happens at big tech companies. But in that kind of interaction, I think it's usually the data scientists run A/B tests and the product teams look at those metrics and have input into which ones to pick. And obviously many more complex inputs, but they have outcome metrics that they're looking at, whereas the editorial curation seems more qualitative and about the content, if I'm understanding correctly. Another thing that it triggers to me or sounds similar to is like reinforcement learning from human feedback, but it's not quite that. You know, you can imagine editorial staff looking at like 2 feeds of content and saying which one is better, but unlike in the RLHF case, they're not being paid $1 an hour and they have more power, and you're not trying to automate them away. You want them always in this process. And then it's also sort of similar to users trying to control their own feed, except it's actually that they're sort of controlling at a meta level. What should the algorithm be doing for users? So I'm just really curious to hear more about concretely what that interaction looks like between, like, how does it work? Are they actually looking at different feeds? Is it mainly that they curate the post and then the ranking goes on top of it, like you said, or they choose certain parts where ranking shouldn't be used? It's hard to give feedback on algorithms in general, so I'm curious, are there tools that you think would be helpful for the editorial staff that would make it easier to do this kind of fine-tuning back and forth? And I guess the broader question is, all of the talks I think touched at, you know, who gets to decide what we are optimizing when we get to this meta problem that I think Alejandro talked about so concretely. When you have these multiple groups and there's asymmetry in their knowledge, how should you, what are some tools that we can do that make that easier? Thanks.
Well, that's that's a big question. I mean, just I won't be lengthy because, you know, otherwise I can get into the rabbit hole and telling you just how we do this, how we do that. But just like a premise, we have made the like a choice. You know, when we started, I think it was from the very start of our team, and I wasn't there back then, but that basically we would rather go for simpler, possibly less accurate approaches in terms of recommenders, but understandable, you know, by humans, and you know, more transparent, rather than going for something that would give us, you know, just higher accuracy but harder to tweak. And so this has been always a starting point. I can say I can tell you about some very practical things we do. And one thing is, we routinely have meetings with editorial. We have weekly meetings with editorial, where, for instance, depending on where we are in the editorial product, of course, but depending on where we are in the development process, we talk about different things. For instance, when we start, you know, the development process for a new recommender, possibly a product gets more input in that, because, for instance, we define where the new recommender should go, what it should do, and but let's say at the time of problem definition, we are all together in the room, so that's, you know, just ensuring all voices are heard. But then, you know, the more you move towards a more technical side, then, well, of course, it depends on where we are. But for instance, when we get to, you know, selecting just a couple of models that seem to be promising, in these, you know, regular meetings, we show the output to editorial, just using some sample of either users or sample of piece of content, and they drive the conversation about, oh, this is problematic. This sounds like just you are surfacing together these sensitive content to these other sensitive content, and this is an association we don't want to make. And I think editorial is just, they are those who are best placed to tell you this, because sometimes, well, I can get to some of the things myself, but in other things, they are the experts of. We have a thick book that are the editorial guidelines, and just they are the experts on that. So, and in order to facilitate these sessions, we develop a tool which is basically a web UI where you can pick 2 different models with and pick either just some piece of content, some seed content, or some user profiles. There are different approaches we follow, and there's a scale like editorial can use. Of course, editorial is not just one person in the room. We have multiple people, and possibly we have one from our team, who is Anna, here. But we generally have people who are experts on the specific product we are working on, like BBC Sounds, which is a on-demand audio platform of the BBC, or iPlayer, which is on-demand video platform, or news, and so on and so forth. And so they leave feedback on this scale, just for each recommendations, and they also leave textual feedback. Now, we are aware that usually just this way you can only evaluate small samples, but this has been useful for us because just as data scientists we say, oh, okay, just let's talk through these, just why do you think that this is inappropriate? Do you think that this shouldn't appear in a list of recommendations? Should it be, maybe don't wait there, should we go down, just understanding what the problems are, and then just going back and, by tweaking the models, and this is why so far we've worked with relatively simple models, because it's been easier for us, first of all, to start this kind of conversation, but also to tweak the models. And once just we become kind of, let's say, experts in this kind of process, we will be able to move on to more complex approaches and just scale these approaches. Does it answer your question?
Maybe I could come in and just pick up a couple of things, more general things. I mean, first of all, I really liked, Smith, your question because you raised, the question of the precarity of moderation and so on, and the interesting prospect that maybe an organization like the big public broadcasters hold out, that, this kind of relationship that Alessandro is describing, could be on a different footing. How about that, Second point, which you also took up, was the user interface. And I mean, that we've had this several times through the few days, which is the idea of, actually, giving choice to users, part of transparency, part of accountability, why not, in fact, hand some agency in terms of the kind of recommender, which interests me. And I think the third one I wanted to pick up is just, if you'll forgive me, Anna and Alessandro, in our talking, you very much conveyed a much more general problem, which is the problem of the values of the professional culture, and the fact that even inside the BBC, getting data science, editorial, product development, higher management to sort of know, and to be able to talk together about what is being sought editorially, what are the values, some of the values I listed. This is not a trivial problem. And to me, it's a lateral link to the big debate in AI trainings, which many of you know about, at the major engineering universities, about how should AI scientists be trained, right? And so far, this is one bugbear of mine, it's stuck on ethics. And I want to say that ethics isn't enough. There are many different kinds of thought, knowledge, political philosophy, social science, of psychology, social psychology we've been hearing the last few days. These have tremendously significant contributions to make. And ethics is a little bit vanilla to me. So just to be cheeky, I'll say that.
Thank you. Yeah, so I want to appreciate what Smith had brought up and sort of what Alejandro was saying, is especially this idea that there is a process which editors are doing, which is essentially training a recommender system. And what is it that we're doing when we are liking and commenting and whatever? We are training a recommender system. The difference is that in one case you have highly paid editors with a lot of experience who are not representative of the broader public. And on the other hand, you have people who are representative of the broader public, but who don't have any time, are not compensated, and are just sort of responding with their gut reaction. And so, in some sense, the idea, the point of this, using this representative microcosm, the citizen assembly, to actually be making these decisions, is to say, let's do something in the middle. Let's take that representative public, a much smaller set of people than you have with the entire, everyone who's using, let's say, Facebook. But give them a lot of the context, give them access to those experts, give them access to the same types of context that an editor might have, and say, okay, here's an example of a bunch of different ways that the ranking system might output something. What do you think? Discuss amongst yourselves. Hear, like, what are the trade-offs of different things given the way that actually might affect your lives to have this kind of output from a recommender system. And then that is a way that we can determine what we should be optimizing for. And just one other clarification, because I realized it wasn't totally clear from what I said earlier. The acquisition, the thing with Twitter, there's collateral damage that this ended. There was no intention by anyone involved to like mess up that project, because I want to make absolutely clear that.
So we have about 5 minutes left before lunch. We'll try to get through the last 2 questions here. We'll go a little quicker through if we can, and then we'll see how it goes. But this is just such fascinating things we could discuss forever, and then everyone will be hungry and mad at me for not moderating.
Hi, I'm Georgina. I'm glad to see a fellow anthropologist here. I'm also an anthropologist working in tech. In anthropology, we are often talking about individualistic versus collectivistic cultures and values. I wonder if successes around deliberative digital democracy in particular are successful in places like Taiwan because they are a collectivistic culture, versus we are also very much on the focus of this conference seems to be like talking about values embedded in individualistic cultures. Products that are being like developed by companies have inherently embedded values that are based on individualistic cultures and where they are coming from. And this brings me to a distinction that I make between like rights and obligations we have as citizens versus rights and obligations we have as consumers. And I was curious to hear if you could perhaps speak to that, like how we can actually think about the values that are embedded, given that distinction that these are different things, and talking about who is going to decide, for example, or who is going to curate what. If you could like think in this framework and not expect from companies to like treat us as citizens when we are actually just consumers.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to come back because great ideas and say, first of all, you know as well as I do as a fellow anthropologist that we're in danger of reifying these ideas of individualistic cultures and collective cultures. I mean, there are lots of collectivist communities, most of us belong to some of them, within a highly individualistic culture like the United States today or Great Britain today. Second point to make, as I alluded to very briefly, but it's a much larger theme in the paper, is that none of these things are static, right? We're all being formed all the time. Brett is clapping over there because we agree on this. Like, we aren't one thing. We're emergent as human beings. We become what our immediate environment and our much larger environment incentivizes us, to use your term, or nudges us or encourages us to become. That's why the culture matters, right? That's why our media culture has enormous impact on us. Back to an old debate in media theory. So I would kind of say that. On citizens and consumers, I have a very cheap one, which is that in the British debate over policy and regulation in the last 20 years, we've wanted to bring these two together, make this homunculus, the citizen-consumer. Because in whatever domain you talk about, be it like, The Wire, or Taylor Swift, or my indie band, like we are both consumers and more. We're moral human beings. We belong to communities. So that distinction seems to me one that we should erode and be interested in eroding, even if in the end we kind of are consumers sometimes.
So you have 2 questions left. Can we do rapid fire, both questions, one after the other, and then each respondent gets 3 sentences to answer both, or something like that. We'll figure it out.
All right, we'll try it. Okay, so hi, I'm Sarah. I used to work at Twitter, focusing on information integrity. So I was lucky enough to be part of Birdwatch's like red teaming exercise, so trying to foresee the risks. So in that vein, I have a question about bridging systems. So especially when they leave the laboratory and enter the real world, which is unfortunately an adversarial threat environment, how can we work to make bridging systems more resilient against 2 types of risks? So one I would call coordinated activity. So bad actors perhaps coordinating to game the system, which might result in unintended consequences. And then something a little more subtle, but potentially insidious, and maybe we're seeing that now on the platform as the user base has changed greatly since, you know, the original training data that I'm assuming the birdwatch model is trained on. What happens if the median point of view were to shift in one direction or another? When I say median point of view, I mean the average Twitter user participating in this program. Does that shift the Overton window of the nodes that meet the requirements of agreement on the opposing viewpoints to actually make it to get published? And why I think this is significant is because Birdwatch, super cool. The team that built it was building something great, and it still has survived, and it's often pointed in the industry as something that shows that bridging systems can be successful. But I want to make sure we're also interrogating the potential vulnerabilities before we then try to completely replace human moderation or other remediations. So that is my question. We can also talk after.
All right. Evie, do you want to do a 1 or 2 sentence quick response, and then we'll talk after the lunch, and then we'll
Sure.
work?
Sure. Don't replace human moderation completely. First of all, we remember the status quo right now. If the Twitter timeline was using bridging-based ranking, not just Birdwatch, that would be probably a huge win for society, even though there would be some of these impacts, because we already have gaming. We already have all those issues are already present. They're just actually probably worse in many cases when you don't have bridging systems. And there are a lot of nuances, and that's not 100% true. But I'm going to leave it at that and just say that this is why we need incredible amounts of investment to figure out how to answer all of these questions as quickly as possible, because the status quo is pretty bad.
Well, thank you, everyone. This is a fantastic panel. If you have a round of applause for our wonderful speakers. And I'm going to pass this off to Katie with logistics about everything that happens after now.
This will be fast. I am hungry too. I just want to take a moment at the close of this symposium to give a round of thanks. I want to thank the audience, those of you who came out today in this miserable weather, everyone who watched yesterday, and the hundreds of people who watched online as well. I want to thank all of our amazing speakers and moderators for the great discussions over the last day and a half. Most of the papers you heard presented also have equally brilliant co-authors who didn't speak but are listed in the program. You can find more about them there. And most of the papers will also be published by us, the Knight First Amendment Institute, in the coming months, so stay tuned for those. And finally, I want to thank Arvind, who has been a really incredible partner on this enormous project, and a great thought leader and a lot of fun to work with. It was our hope in planning this that this would be seen as a foundational event in the field of amplification studies, and I think we pretty much did that. So congratulations and thank you. And now let's eat.
Also, I think Katie made this happen with so many well-organized emails and Google Drives and everything else. So there's an applause there as well. Feel free to eat.